Hey, everybody. Uh, Welcome to our talk. Today, we're going to talk to you about how here at Goldman Sachs we are automating disk and memory collection. But real quick, we are both cloud security architects at Goldman Sachs. Vaishnav and I are part of what we call the Sky team at Goldman Sachs. So the Sky team is responsible for securing the firm's use of public cloud. And currently, we're focused on AWS, and we're going to talk to you about the solution I just described. It's been a large firm-wide initiative that we've been focused on for about 8 months now, and we're really excited to talk to you about that. We both hold a couple certs from SANS, as well as a lot of the foundational AWS certs, and we were both previously D4 consultants for KPMG, and we graduated from the University of Notre Dame the same year. So on paper, we are the exact same person.
Incidentally, that is our fun fact. So without further ado, let's move on to introducing our solution. So the problem statement that we were really trying to tackle is that there is no ready-made solution to really automate the collection of disk and memory evidence from compute resources in the cloud, especially given the scale of our enterprise. Our enterprise consists of 3 AWS organizations consisting of over 3,000 accounts. So we really needed a scalable, auditable, and repeatable process to satisfy our stakeholders. Just a quick note about AWS organizations, as this is key to really understanding our solution. AWS organizations, for those of you on the call who aren't aware, is an AWS service that helps you manage billing, control access compliance, security, and share resources across your AWS accounts. So we have 3 AWS organizations that basically cover our 3 technical organizations in Goldman.
So at the heart of our solution for automating both disk and memory forensics is AWS Security Hub. And if you're not familiar with Security Hub, it is a single place that aggregates and prioritizes security findings. It also integrates with a lot of AWS services, and I have some of them on the left here, and it also plugs into AWS partner solutions and integrates with third-party solutions. When we were designing our solution, we had a pretty specific use case in mind. We need to accept 2 main sources. And these are identified by our 2 feeds here. So we have automated sources on the left, and we have manual triggers on the right. As part of the automated sources, these sources come from a variety of AWS products. I have some on the left here, but you'll see Amazon Guard Duty, Amazon Inspector. This can also incorporate it with Macy and other Amazon offerings. But they can also integrate with third-party tools such as your IDS, your IPS, or your EDR. And on the right side, we have our manual triggers. And it just simply boils down to the fact that no one tool can catch everything. We love Amazon, but they're not going to catch everything. And if our security and incident response team, our CERT, suspected that an instance may be compromised, we wanted to provide them with the means to kick off our disk or memory collection workflow without having to wake me up or Vaishnav up in the middle of the night, because then we'll be cranky. And this is where the manual input comes in. So we would receive a third-party notification, maybe that an instance has been compromised. Maybe it's sending out malicious network traffic that are IDS or IPS detected, or it's trying to brute force other hosts, or maybe there's a critical pen test finding that you just want to verify that you're covered from. So we allow our process to be triggered manually in this workflow.
So just to talk about our collection outputs from both our disk and memory evidence collection. For disk, we do a full DD, which stands for direct dump, which is a bit-for-bit copy of each volume attached to the affected instance. And this is to basically satisfy regulatory requirements, given that we're a financial services firm. The regulations that we have to adhere to require us to capture a full disk capture. And then in addition, we also collect the log file from DC3DD, which is our disk forensic collection tool of choice. This log file contains the hash of the DD image, as well as the start and end times of the collection process. For memory, we capture a memory dump in the raw format, which again is just a bit-for-bit copy. And this is for ease of use with volatility, which is our memory forensic analysis tool of choice. If the collection is from a Linux EC2 instance, we create a custom memory profile to allow us to parse the memory image using volatility. And this custom memory profile contains the dwarf dump and the system map files from the EC2 instance. And in addition, just like with the disk collection, we also collect log files detailing the commands run, the status, whether they succeeded or failed, and their timestamps, again, for audit reasons.
We're about to deep dive into both the disk collection workflow in detail and the memory collection workflow. But before we do that, we just wanted to put some main takeaways kind of on the screen and introduce these to kind of ground us all during the technical details of the talk. The first point we wanted to emphasize is that there's so much more going on behind the scenes than you may originally think. So specifically at Goldman, we're dealing with 3 different organizations, as Vaishnav had stated, and that's totaling over 3,000 just AWS accounts. We haven't even talked about multi-cloud solutions yet. So not only that, but we have various types of EC2 instances running in all these accounts, and they use varying forms of encryption, and they may or may not have some level of logging or network connectivity. So a lot of question marks here. In terms of standardization, we could probably do better. But our solution really had to consider, every aspect of these, from cross-account access to EBS or snapshot encryption, how we're going to share KMS keys cross-account, and then if there's any sort of access logging there too. So that's point one. Secondly, if you automate a task correctly, your mean time to respond, your cost, and your error rate, those should all hopefully go down. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but even though we invested a lot of time in building this solution up front, we expect our return on investment to be high, and we're saving money in the long term. So our next point, we needed something that would scale easily. Again, with the number of accounts we have, it needs to scale. And that's why we're using a lot of different AWS services. There are third-party offerings that could probably do something similar, but AWS services really plugged into our use case. And all of our resources are spun up and used only when needed. When they're not needed, they're not running. So this really helps reduce cost. And lastly, so our risk tolerance is pretty low. We wanted to do this collection in the most secure way possible. Again, we're a financial services firm, so you could very well stream a lot of this over the public internet. Our risk tolerance is a lot lower than that. We're heavily monitored by regulations, and that's a great thing. You can ask any of the lawyer or the privacy people on the team. But because of that, our solution leverages VPC endpoints in the AWS backbone network almost entirely.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so we're going to deep dive into our disk collection process now. And before we do that, we just want to basically contrast basically the process that was before the automated process was put into production, and then how our process now improves that.
So this was probably the hardest part of our solution, was coming up just with this diagram. I'm not very artistic, so this cool graphic took us a while to put together. It shows a lot of the pain points of doing all of this manually. There was a lot of things where we had to assume a role into a target account, create snapshots for each EBS volume that's attached to the compromised instance. We had to encrypt it with a shared key. We had to share it back with our account. We had to exit through that account and then create a volume for each snapshot and attach that volume to an analysis instance. And then we had to jump through a bastion host to get actually on that analysis instance. We had to mount the volume, run DC3DD, somehow copy the evidence to an S3 bucket. We had to verify all the hashes matched. We had to unmount the volumes, do a lot of exercise cleanup. And if it was a relatively large EBS volume, it could take anywhere between an hour or half day just to perform this collection. And that was fine, as we were more immature at the time. But our automated solution looks to automate a lot of this, really speed up the collection time, and do a lot of the verification on our end.
So before going into the automated solution, just a quick couple points about Security Hub. As Ryan had mentioned, this is our centralized security event repository. So we use Security Hub basically for 2 main reasons. One is Security Hub follows a master member subscription model, where a finding that is inputted into a member account automatically replicates itself into the master account. And then any changes you make to the master account, it's automatically replicated back to the member account. And then the second reason is it enforces a common finding format, which basically allows adding new detection sources to this pipeline extremely easy. So this automated process really takes away the pain that Ryan was describing in our manual process. So essentially at a high level, we get a trigger from GuardDuty or third-party integration or any of the sources that Ryan had talked about previously. And then due to this member-master relationship, the finding that is inserted into the member account gets replicated to our master account, which is a security account that's controlled by our team. So after it is inserted into the master account, the CloudWatch events rule basically picks up the finding creation and then triggers our forensic pipeline step function. So our step function is our orchestration tool that we use to coordinate cross-account access into the monitored account This is all done by various Lambdas. And then once we have the cross-account access, we create a snapshot of each volume attached to the compromised instance, create an encrypted copy of each snapshot, and then encrypt it with our cross-account key, and then share it back with our security account. Following which we spin up a collector VM instance, which we will talk about in a few slides, which basically mounts the volume, streams a DD image of that volume to our evidence S3 bucket, and then shuts itself down and self-terminates. In addition, we have an AWS CloudWatch logs agent installed on our collector VM instance, which allows us to monitor the progress of this process. And again, more on that in the next slide. So as we were just talking about our collector VM EC2 instance, we basically use this to perform the actual collection of the volume. It is an instance created from a custom AMI that's based on the Amazon Linux 2 AMI. It's created by Lambda that is triggered via a scheduled CloudWatch events rule that basically updates all the packages installed and then stores the new custom AMI ID in an SSM parameter, which is read and accessed by the forensic pipeline step function that we detailed in the previous slide. So this collector VM instance basically follows the principle of least privilege. It has a very restrictive security group with no inbound rules and no SSH key associated with it because we don't really need to access it once it's spun up. So our collection process, once the Lambda spins the collector VM instance up, it associates a volume ID assigned for it to collect as an environmental variable, and that's included in the instance user data. The user data also basically runs a script that attaches the assigned volume to the instance. And then once that volume is attached, it triggers an in-cron job. So for those of you who aren't aware, in-cron is a Linux utility that allows you to trigger actions based on file system modifications. So when you attach a volume to a Linux instance, that creates a block device in the dev directory that our in-cron job monitors. And then the action it takes is it runs DC3DD on the attached volume and then streams it to our evidence S3 bucket. So while DC3DD is running, we still want to monitor the progress of our collection. And we don't have any access to the hands-on keyboard access to this VM. So that's why we have a CloudWatch logs agent that streams that collection log to a CloudWatch log group that allows us to monitor the progress. Once this process is complete, the EC2 instance self-terminates. So we basically perform self-automated cleanup as well.
So given that this is a relatively short talk, we can't deep dive into everything, but we did want to include some pro tips that we've kind of learned along the way. And these are meant to help you if you were to try to recreate some of this and avoid a lot of headaches that we ran into and had to solve. So the first one is multi-threading versus concurrent executions. So our Lambdas leverage multi-threading so that each volume attached to our collector VM EC2 instance is processed independently. And in a similar vein, so a collector VM instance is spun up per compromised volume. So we do that concurrently. The second point we wanted to talk about is full disk collection versus triage collection. So this is kind of an age-old question. Do you collect the whole disk, or do you just collect certain files that you're interested in? And we, for regulatory reasons, choose to collect the full disk image, but you may very well just collect to do a more targeted collection of different log files on the disk. Neither I think is necessarily right or wrong. If you wanted to do a targeted collection, you could leverage SSM, or you could stream logs directly off the host with the CloudWatch logs agent. The third point is really interesting. So we're able to leverage DC3DD to stream output directly to S3. So when we collect a volume, the data that we're collecting is never touching disk. That was going to be a problem. So if we're collecting a 100 gig volume, 100 gigs is never touching disk. It's basically doing a bit by bit stream directly to S3. So therefore, we didn't have to account for that extra size on our host, which was really nice. So no additional storage is requireable. The next point, so ours is auditable and done entirely over the AWS backbone network. We're leveraging a bunch of different log sources, namely CloudTrail to log Amazon API calls, and we're using VPC endpoints wherever possible. Cost versus collection speed. So it basically boils down to how fast do you want the data versus how much you're willing to pay. We found that using an M5A instance class for our collector VM instance was a good compromise between both, because it allows for a high max network bandwidth at a very reasonable cost. Instant store data, so you may or may not know that instant store data is not collected when you do an EBS snapshot. So just keep that in mind. We have a workflow. That actually goes ahead, and we have the DC3DD agent present on all of our volumes, and we just stream that, or all of our collector VM instances, we just stream that directly to S3. And lastly, logging. So you may or may not know SSD makes use of trim and wear leveling operations and can produce an inconsistent hash before and after collection. So in order to produce a consistent hash, we convert the EBS snapshots to hard disk drive volumes, and then we begin our collection. So the hash is managed.
Okay, so we were going to jump into a deep dive of our memory collection, but in the interest of time, we can basically skip over our manual process. This was basically very similar to our disk collection process, where we'd have to do a bunch of manual steps, which we wanted to avoid. And then after automation, basically, we leverage the same step function to orchestrate the various steps, including cross-account access. And we use AWS Systems Manager SSM agent to run line to stream the raw memory dump and system map and dwarf dump files that creates our memory profile to our evidence bucket that will then be processed via volatility.
So I guess real quick, so if we go back one slide, I know we're kind of running out of time here. So planning was important for a lot of this memory collection. We wanted to make sure that we had all of the tools necessarily on an EC2 instance, because again, these EC2 instances are in a monitored account. So we can't necessarily control every aspect of these EC2 instances, but we can mandate that they do have some tools on them, right? So we want them to have SSM pre-installed. We want them to have different memory collection tools installed. And we want to make sure there's a route for that EC2 instance to stream a memory image directly to S3. And that's where things get tricky. So I guess as we move into some pro tips real quick, so tracked versus untracked connections, the flow from the previous slide of this one isn't very apparent. But if you just attach a restrictive security group to an instance that you know is compromised, not all traffic is terminated. So there is some traffic that can persist. If you're not aware of that, I recommend looking up the difference between tracked and untracked connections. Streaming directly to S3. So if you're going to stream a file directly to S3, you need to include an expected size flag if the object is greater than 50 gigs. Otherwise, you'll run into some problems there. And then you need to consider business impact. So by this, we were talking about how risk tolerant is your organization. So can you leverage VPC endpoints? There's a kind of a pain for S3 specifically, but you can also do this over the public internet via NAT gateways or internet gateways as well. And you also want to understand when to collect memory. Maybe it's not feasible for you to collect memory on every single alert that fires. So just have your use case there.
Yeah, it's really important. Just as closing thoughts, we wanted to share our future work. We want to basically, sorry, are we out of time?
No, keep going.
Sorry. So we want to do our instance store collection, put that into production, leverage file integrity monitoring. As Ryan was saying, we install our necessary security tools and agents to perform memory collection. We want to do file integrity monitoring on that to make sure an end user doesn't modify these tools and break our process. We also want to automate the analysis. Our next step is to automate the actual analysis of the evidence that we collected, and we're looking to use ECS or Fargate. The one downside is Fargate does not support Windows platform versions, but probably would use ECS for that. And then downstream analysis, assign a confidence score based on indicators of compromise, and generate example reports basically to help the good folks out on our security incident response teams to respond to these incidents in a more efficient manner.
So I know we sped through a lot of the memory aspect of the talk. To be honest, these two topics could have been broken out into their own separate talk. We will make sure these slides are available, so definitely give them a read. We can include some speaker notes in there too, to be honest, so you can read through kind of our thoughts as well. With that, we've included our Goldman Sachs emails as well. I would say we're both very active on LinkedIn as well. And then I'm not too active on Twitter, but my handle's there as well. If you have any questions as you're reviewing this, try to implement this, Vaishnav and I are more than happy to set up a meeting, talk through kind of some of the pain points with y'all. But we do appreciate the time today. And any questions you have now, we're more than happy to answer them.
And we'll be monitoring Slack as well. So.
Thanks. Just to start, I think you mentioned the use of ECS to orchestrate this capability. Have you thought about doing, or have you seen anything that does the forensic process against Fargate or ECS containers themselves?
So ECS containers that are not Fargate are run on an EC2 instance, so that would basically be covered by our use case, at least as far as the disk analysis is concerned. But for orchestration of our workflow, we're actually using step functions. So our ECS, I know we kind of sped through that at the end, but our thought was to break out basically the analysis tasks into different ECS tasks, like running log to timeline, bulk extractor perhaps, things like that.
And there's a question about sort of the value of memory collection and what sorts of attacks you've seen it capture. So Ben from Slack asks, we didn't find memory collection capabilities to be worth a lot of the work that was required. So what was it that made you think this was valuable enough?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So especially when a lot of the memory collection is done manually, it's very time consuming. So by automating a lot of this process, we look to make memory forensics a lot more available to the everyday investigator. Vaishnav and I do a lot of different purple teams for Goldman Sachs too. We leverage Cobalt Strike, and we do a lot of in-memory process evasion, as well as encrypting processes in memory too. A lot of stuff we don't even touch disk. So I would argue that getting memory forensics and memory artifacts is pretty important, especially as your attacker gets more advanced. You're going to see some indicators of compromise that you won't see unless you look in memory.
And the last question is, I'm sure, inevitable, but I know. Thank you for preparing for sharing the slides with us. Is there any intent to open source any part of this work?
Open source is tricky, given we have a giant team of lawyers at Goldman Sachs. I will say we do have some plans on writing a more detailed white paper in the future, where we kind of go through and we talk about each element specifically. So I don't know if any code will be readily made available, but the white paper should come in a couple months, and we'll detail a lot of this workflow in detail.
Yep.
I had to ask. Thanks so much. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Our next talk is Nick Jones on automating attack simulation in the cloud. So thank you very much, Ryan and Vaishnav.
Thanks, guys.